How does a plain brown envelope, delivered without a name, without a sound, end up shaking the highest court in America? For years, Chief Justice John Roberts stood untouchable. But when attorney Jasmine Crockett opened that envelope, she didn't just find evidence. She found a fault line. This isn't a story about politics. It's about the quiet dismantling of trust, and one woman who decided to face it head-on. It arrived on a Thursday. No return address, no name, just a plain brown envelope left at the edge of her front porch. Jasmine Crockett, attorney and former public defender, picked it up without thinking much. In her line of work, unexpected mail wasn't rare. But something about the weight of it felt intentional. Inside, a stack of printed documents, no cover sheet, no preamble. Just bold headers, foreign letterheads, scanned images of handwritten memos, and financial transfers. Her fingers stopped when she saw one name appear repeatedly: Chief Justice John Roberts. She sat down, not in her living room, not in her office. Right there on the porch step, as if moving any further would somehow change the meaning of what she'd just read. The documents outlined a series of meetings between U.S. federal judges and members of the Middle Temple in the U.K. Included were funding receipts tied to Soros-backed foundations and communications discussing global legal harmonization, a phrase she knew was code for surrendering national authority in the name of progress. It didn't feel like gossip. It felt surgical, precise, and cold. Jasmine wasn't naive. She'd seen systemic failure before. She'd fought cases where justice bent under pressure. But this wasn't a mistake. This was infrastructure. A quiet, intentional restructuring of the very system the American people believed protected them. She opened her laptop, hands steady but cold, started verifying names, dates, case rulings. Within 2 hours, the patterns were clear. Certain judges had consistently ruled in favor of foreign-aligned policy interests, immigration, trade, tech regulation, with decisions that mirrored language from the leaked documents. They weren't just connected, they were coordinated, and that's when it hit her. This wasn't a leak, it was a warning. Someone on the inside wanted this to be found, but not by just anyone. By her. For a moment, she considered turning it over to the press. Let it become a media firestorm, let the talking heads fight over it. But she knew how that game played out. Noise, distraction, delay. In the end, nothing changes. The system digests its own scandal and keeps moving. So she made a different choice. She picked up the envelope again, held it in both hands like it was a living thing, then walked inside, locked the door, and started making a list. Not of names, but of people she could trust. The kind of people who didn't blink when the truth got ugly. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the pavement. And on that quiet street, no one knew that a line had just been crossed, one that could not be uncrossed. Because this time, the person they underestimated wasn't a threat. She was the reckoning. Jasmine didn't call for a meeting. She didn't send messages. She showed up, in person, one by one. The first was Caleb Moran, a federal investigator with a record so clean it was suspicious. He lived in a small apartment near Capitol Hill, spent most of his time digging through contracts, backlogs, and digital fingerprints. Jasmine handed him a sealed folder and said, "You didn't get this from me." He didn't ask questions, just scanned the first page, then closed the file and nodded. "Give me 3 days," he said. Next was Mara Jensen, former DOJ strategist now working in policy research after she left government for ethical reasons. Translation: she didn't want to sign off on what she couldn't justify. Jasmine met her in a public library, mid-afternoon, in the archives section. Mara listened, didn't interrupt. When Jasmine finished, she whispered, "I've seen the outlines of this. I thought I was being paranoid." Finally, Rachel Cortez, a tough-as-nails prosecutor who'd once brought down a city council for bribery. They met on a walking path just outside a courthouse where Rachel was due in 30 minutes. Jasmine didn't say much, just showed her the Roberts transcript. Rachel stopped mid-step, stared for a full 10 seconds, then muttered, "We're not leaking this. We're building a case." There was no master plan. No office with glass walls and whiteboards full of strategy. What they had was time, silence, and purpose. Each of them knew this couldn't be fought in headlines. It had to be methodical, quiet, and real. They called themselves the Four, not out of ego, but because secrecy demanded simplicity. No paper trail, no group messages, one phone each, burners. Every conversation face-to-face, every file encrypted and split into segments. They'd meet in parks, diners, libraries, never the same place twice. The danger wasn't theoretical. Jasmine had already noticed a car that passed her house twice in the same hour. Caleb's emails were taking longer to send. Rachel received a blank envelope with nothing inside, just enough to say, "We see you." Still, none of them backed down. Because the more they dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't about a few bad judges. It was a design. A foreign influence legal lattice woven into the highest levels of federal court, redirecting case law, creating precedents, slowly shifting the meaning of the Constitution itself. And they knew, bringing it to light wouldn't just expose corruption, it would shake the country. But they weren't trying to burn the house down. They were trying to show it had termites in the walls. One night, after hours of combing through judge profiles and foundation grant records, Mara looked up from her laptop. "You know what scares me?" she said. "It's not that this exists, it's how long it's been there without anyone noticing." Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked out the window. The city lights blinked like they always did. Normal, familiar. But now she knew familiarity was sometimes the greatest disguise of all. She closed the laptop. "We're not just building a case," she said. "We're building a mirror, and once people see what's in it, they'll never unsee it." The breakthrough came quietly. No fireworks, just a name, buried in an academic itinerary from 5 years ago. A federal judge, keynote speaker at a legal symposium in Brussels, expenses covered by an organization tied to an offshore trust. Caleb traced the payment. Mara found the event listed under cross-border legal integration. Rachel pulled the rulings. Every one of them showed a pattern, decisions that didn't just interpret U.S. law but redefined it through foreign lenses. That one judge became 10, then 30. By the end of the week, the list had crossed 300. Many of them were respected. Some had been appointed by presidents both left and right. But they all had one thing in common: repeated involvement in foreign-funded legal forums, fellowships, and advisory boards that pushed a very specific agenda: global legal synchronization. A phrase that sounded harmless until you realized what it meant: bypassing the messy democratic process of domestic lawmaking in favor of imported norms approved behind closed doors. Jasmine looked at the board. Names, dates, red thread connecting judges to conferences, foundations, advisory roles. It looked like a conspiracy theory until you realized every connection was documented, public, just never seen as a whole. They weren't hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight. "This is a second judiciary," Jasmine said during one of their late-night meetings. "Funded from abroad, dressed up in legitimacy, but answering to interests no one voted for." For older Americans watching this unfold, the betrayal wasn't theoretical. Many had spent decades believing in the slow but steady rhythm of American justice. They believed in checks and balances, in appeals, in the idea that even if the system bent, it didn't break. But this was something else. This was the quiet rewriting of legal values through influence, not argument. Through funding, not votes. For people like Donald, 73, a retired Vietnam veteran who had once served jury duty with pride, it felt like the ground shifted beneath him. "We weren't told the rules were changing," he said. "We were just expected to keep obeying them." The deeper the team dug, the more chilling the reality became. Some judges had used identical language in their opinions, lifted from the white papers of foreign think tanks. Others had ruled on cases involving corporations tied to the very entities that paid for their overseas trips. And still, there was no outrage, no headlines, no oversight. That silence said everything. Mara found a memo buried in an internal report. Judicial alignment with international norms reduces litigation friction and promotes systemic stability. Jasmine read it twice. "Stability for who?" she asked. Rachel didn't respond. She was staring at a name she knew too well. A judge who once overturned a case she prosecuted, a case involving trafficking and foreign money. Back then, she thought she lost on legal grounds. Now she wasn't so sure. The mood shifted. It wasn't just about Roberts anymore. It was about what he represented. A network, a culture, a quiet dismantling of legal independence dressed up as modernization. Outside, a late train passed. Inside, no one spoke. Each of them sat with the weight of what they'd uncovered. Not scandal, not crime. Something harder to name and harder to prove. But Jasmine knew, when the truth is this big, you don't shout it, you show it. Piece by piece, name by name. And once you do, silence becomes impossible. The press conference wasn't announced. No flyers, no advance email, just a last-minute notice taped to the courthouse bulletin board. Statement by attorney Jasmine Crockett, 2 p.m., room 214. A few journalists wandered in out of curiosity. Some recognized her, most didn't. At 1:58 p.m. she walked in with a single folder. No entourage, no podium. Just her, a long table, and a small speaker placed dead center. She didn't begin with accusations. She didn't lead with emotion. She read names, dates, travel records. She recited transcripts of judicial symposiums funded by foreign interests. She cited rulings that mirrored non-binding international charters, rulings that changed real lives. And then she paused. From the folder, she removed a thumb drive, plugged it into a simple black recorder, pressed play. The voice that followed was unmistakable. Chief Justice John Roberts. Calm, controlled, precise. The role of the judge, he said, is not to serve the people, but to serve the system. The people come and go, but the system must endure. The room froze. One journalist lowered his pen. Another leaned forward, mouth slightly open. Jasmine didn't explain. She let the words hang in the air like smoke from a candle just extinguished. There was no denial, no clarification, only truth. And it spoke for itself. For older Americans watching the clip online later that night, the reaction was visceral. They didn't need legal analysis. They didn't need commentary. They had grown up believing that government served at the consent of the governed. That a judge's robe wasn't a shield from scrutiny, but a symbol of responsibility. To hear the highest legal authority in the country describe justice as something separate from the people, it felt like something had broken. Not just in the system, but inside them. Marjorie, 70, a former public school principal, said it out loud. He forgot who built that system, who funded it, who obeyed it even when it failed them. Back at the courthouse, no one clapped, no questions were asked. Jasmine closed the folder, stood up, and walked out the same door she came in. Later, the media would call it the moment the story went national. But for Jasmine and her team, it was just one step. A necessary one. Because once the public heard that voice, no explanation could soften it. No press release could spin it. In the hours that followed, copies of the recording spread like wildfire. Talk shows replayed it, legal experts scrambled for context, politicians avoided comment. But regular people, they listened. Not to the headlines, to the tone, to the choice of words, to the absence of remorse. And for many, that was enough. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She met the team that evening at a parking lot 2 blocks from the courthouse. Caleb leaned against a bench, arms crossed. Rachel lit a cigarette, something she hadn't done in years. Mara sat in her car, door open, eyes fixed on the radio as callers flooded the lines with reactions. No one spoke for a while. Then Rachel finally said, "We just pulled the pin. Let's hope we know where it lands." It didn't take days. It took hours. The clip of John Roberts' voice spread faster than any campaign ad, any scandal, any courtroom drama. By midnight, 2 hashtags had overtaken every platform. #resign Roberts and #jail Jasmine. The nation didn't just react, it fractured. On one side, Americans who saw the recording as the final crack in an already eroded foundation. People who believed that Crockett had done what no one else dared, speak the truth plainly, with evidence. On the other, those who saw her as a threat, a disruptor, someone looking to dismantle tradition under the guise of justice. Protests broke out, not just in Washington, but in places like Des Moines, Savannah, Albuquerque, places where people had long felt unseen, but now felt something very real had been exposed. Either a hero's courage or a dangerous insubordination. In front of courthouses, people held signs, "Justice is ours," "Jasmine for truth." Others read, "Stop the smear," "Stand with Roberts." It wasn't just a legal debate anymore. It was cultural, moral, deeply personal. For older Americans who had seen the country divide before, over war, over race, over rights, this moment felt familiar but more fragile. Because this time, the fracture wasn't about an event. It was about trust. And when trust breaks in a courtroom, it breaks everywhere. Elaine, 68, a retired factory worker from Michigan, watched the protests on TV and whispered, "I've seen this before. When people start choosing sides over truth, something worse always follows." And the divide wasn't only on the streets, News anchors picked sides. Former clerks defended Roberts. Civil rights attorneys stood behind Jasmine. Politicians released carefully worded statements that said little but stirred plenty. Crockett became more than a name. She became a symbol. To some, she was courage. To others, chaos. Threats arrived in her inbox. Her office received anonymous packages. Caleb's apartment was vandalized. Mara's name trended for reasons that had nothing to do with law. Rachel was followed home one night. Still, none of them backed down, because what they were uncovering wasn't about public approval. It was about a system long overdue for accountability. In one town, a judge's office was graffitied. In another, a church held a candlelight vigil for judicial integrity. One side screamed, the other prayed, but neither looked away. Jasmine stayed silent through it all, not out of fear, but discipline. She understood something the headlines didn't. The louder the country got, the more careful she needed to be. Because her fight wasn't for attention. It was for clarity. At sunrise one morning, as protests continued just a few blocks from her home, she stood by her window. No news crew, no speech, just a quiet moment before the next storm. In that silence she knew, this wasn't the climax. It was the test, and what came next would define not just her legacy, but the country's. It came the same way the first one did. No knock, no message, just another envelope, same brown paper, same silence, left at the foot of her door. But this time, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She opened it standing in the hallway, eyes scanning line after line of a memo marked Confidential, Internal Doge Review. It wasn't hearsay, it wasn't fragments. It was a 300-page report, time-stamped, signed, and sourced, tracing a direct line between foreign-funded legal conferences and a coordinated influence strategy targeting the U.S. judiciary. This wasn't just about Roberts anymore. This was systemic. The memo included correspondence between multiple judges and offshore policy groups, internal emails detailing financial gifts, travel perks, and subtle suggestions on how future rulings might align with international expectations. One section outlined how specific court decisions had been praised in foreign strategy reports before they were even made public in the United States. Jasmine sat down, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she needed a moment to absorb the weight of what had just been placed in her hands. This wasn't ammunition. It was confirmation. For older Americans, this was the moment it all made sense. The slow drift they'd felt for years, the rulings that didn't align with common sense, the cases dismissed without reason, it had a source. And now, it had a face. George, 72, a retired railroad engineer, had followed every update. When the second envelope came to light, he told his grandson, "They've been grooming the law, not serving it. Now she's the only one calling it out." Caleb verified every signature. Mara cross-checked dates with policy shifts. Rachel found that 2 of the judges named in the memo had ruled against her in previous cases, ones that now made a lot more sense. They debated how to release it. Some wanted to go public immediately, but Jasmine insisted on clarity before spectacle. They didn't leak it to a paper. They uploaded it to a public archive. No paywall, no filters, just truth, raw and complete. The report spread like a fault line opening beneath the legal world. Law schools scrambled. Think tanks issued denials. Judges went quiet. Journalists struggled to verify what was already verified. But for the people, the message was simple. It was real. And it had been happening for years. One section of the report stood out. A handwritten note from a judge, referring to Roberts. He wants to modernize everything. Says if we don't adapt to global norms, we'll be left behind. Rachel read it aloud and said, "Adapt to who? Who gets to write those norms?" That question echoed through every courthouse, every legal forum, every living room watching the news that night. And while most institutions braced for impact, Jasmine prepared something else. A final step. Because now that the truth was exposed, it needed to be answered. Not with more outrage, but with accountability. The hearing wasn't called a trial. Officially, it was a special review session convened by the Senate Judiciary Committee, but the room felt heavier than most trials. Every seat taken, every phone recording, every eye locked on the tall figure entering under oath, Chief Justice John Roberts. He looked smaller than usual, not physically but in presence. The quiet certainty that once filled the room when he spoke was gone. Now, he seemed like a man standing in front of a mirror that finally reflected everything. Jasmine didn't attend. Her team sat in the back row, Rachel with her arms crossed, Mara with a yellow legal pad on her lap, Caleb watching the room instead of the witness. The first hour was procedural. Then came the recordings, the memos, the financial trail, the DOJ report, line after line, page after page. Roberts didn't deny the facts. He didn't call them false. What he did was speak. "I believed we were modernizing," he said, "preparing the judiciary for a more connected world. I never thought it would be seen as betrayal. But it wasn't about how it was seen. It was about what it was." The older Americans watching from home, many of them who had served on juries, voted in every election, paid taxes faithfully. They didn't need spin. They didn't want redemption arcs. They wanted ownership, and they got it. Because after 3 hours of evidence and silence, Roberts looked up and said plainly, "I crossed a line." That sentence, simple as it was, felt like a tide breaking. Not because it changed the facts, but because it admitted what so many powerful figures never would, that decisions have consequences, and even a Chief Justice is not above that truth. Cliff, 74, a former Air Force officer, told his wife after watching it live, that wasn't justice being served, that was justice remembering its own name. Rachel didn't smile. Neither did Jasmine when the news reached her. There was no joy in watching the fall of someone who had once represented the highest legal ideal, only a quiet understanding. This was necessary. By the end of the day, Roberts announced his resignation. No carefully crafted statement. Just a short paragraph emailed to the press. "I step down in acknowledgement that the role I was trusted with requires more than intellect. It requires the humility to know when trust has been lost." His gavel, the one he'd used for 15 years, was boxed and sealed in the clerk's office later that evening. It would not strike again, and just like that, the symbol that once commanded silence had fallen into silence itself. Outside, the air felt still. No protests, no cheers, just the calm that comes when a storm finally releases what it's held too long. It started as a draft, circulated quietly among a few congressional offices, passed hand to hand, redlined and rewritten late into the night. No slogans, no grandstanding, just a single, focused purpose: to make sure what happened could never happen again. The proposal was simple in theory, radical in practice: a permanent oversight commission for the federal judiciary, independent, investigative, with the power to audit, subpoena, and publicly report judicial conduct in real time. For weeks, it moved through committees with unusual speed. The media barely kept up, and when it reached the floor, the vote wasn't split down party lines. It was split by conscience. In the end, it passed. Not with thunder, but with quiet resolve. The signing took place in a small chamber, not the Rose Garden, not prime time. Just a wooden desk, a few cameras, and a pen laid out next to a leather-bound copy of the bill. Jasmine didn't speak. She wasn't seated at the table. But she was there, standing near the back wall, watching. The room paused as the president signed the last page. A single stroke of ink, and with it, decades of unchecked silence finally met structure. For Americans watching on television, especially older generations who had waited a lifetime to see accountability taken seriously, the moment struck deep. Angela, 69, a retired postal worker, wiped her eyes when she saw it. "That's not politics," she whispered. "That's repair." Because they had seen systems break before. They'd seen apologies without action, hearings without consequence. But this was different. This was written into law. The commission wouldn't fix everything. No law ever does. But it would mean that power no longer operated in darkness. That robes didn't make someone untouchable. That even the highest office in the courts would know someone is watching. Outside the chamber, a quiet crowd had gathered. No chants, just presence. One woman held a sign that read, "Law must belong to the people again." The pen used to sign the bill would be placed in the National Archives, not as a trophy, but as a marker. That day, no confetti fell, no anthem played, but something far more enduring happened. A system took a breath and changed. They asked her to run for office, state senate, Congress, even whispers of a presidential ticket. The offers came with donors lined up, full-page features, and the kind of language that always ends in power. Jasmine turned them all down. She said it simply, "I didn't do this to get a seat. I did it because the law forgot who it's supposed to protect." And with that, she went back to work. No title change, no new office, just the same desk, the same stack of case files, and the same fire that brought her here. But the country had changed. A judge in Ohio resigned quietly, citing ethical fatigue. A law student in Baltimore started a scholarship for first-generation lawyers and named it after her. In Houston, a courtroom bailiff stopped a young attorney before trial and said, "You're about to pull a Jasmine, aren't you?" It stuck. Pulling a Jasmine became a phrase. It meant standing when others stay seated. It meant putting the system on notice. It meant doing the right thing, even if no one claps. For Americans who had spent years watching decisions handed down from marble steps, this story didn't just break news. It gave language to something they'd always felt but rarely saw. Justice served without a spotlight. Integrity without negotiation. Franklin, 76, a retired welder from Missouri, said it best to his daughter over dinner. She didn't win a war. She reminded the country what it means to stand your ground without raising your voice. Years later, when journalists looked back, they asked what made her different. It wasn't her background. It wasn't strategy. It was the way she never tried to convince people with outrage. She let the truth walk in on its own feet. And in a time where everything felt too loud, that kind of quiet changed everything. The final image wasn't a courtroom. It was a graduation stage in New Orleans. A young woman walked across in a plain black gown. No frills, no fanfare, just a name stitched onto her stole in simple thread. Jasmine Crockett. Not the person. The idea. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of abuse from those meant to protect you, type 1 in the comments. If you still believe quiet courage can change a broken system, type 2. And if this story spoke to something deep in you, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories that don't chase headlines. We follow what matters. Let your number carry your voice. Let your click keep the truth moving.